The wind that whips across the highest point of Long Island's Cold Spring Harbor does not feel like a natural phenomenon, it feels like a warning. If you stand there today in the gray light of a November dawn looking up at the limestone behemoth known as Oheka Castle, you are struck not by the beauty of the structure, but by the overwhelming, crushing silence of it. It is a silence that weighs heavy on the chest, a silence that speaks of ambitions so large they consumed the men who held them. This is the second largest private home ever built in America, a residence of 127 rooms spanning over 100,000 square feet, yet it was never really a home. It was a stage set. It was a fortress. It was a desperate plea for acceptance, carved out of steel and stone and thrust into the sky by a man who possessed everything except the one thing he truly wanted. To understand Oheka, you must first understand the landscape of the early 20th century, not the geography of maps, but the geography of class. The North Shore of Long Island in 1919 was not merely a suburb, it was the Gold Coast, a mythic stretch of territory where the American aristocracy retreated to play at being European royalty. This was a world of Vanderbilts and Roosevelts, a closed ecosystem of white Protestant hegemony where lineage mattered more than liquidity and where the gates were locked tight against outsiders. Into this world stepped Otto Hermann Kahn. He was a man of immense culture, a banker of unparalleled skill, and a figure of striking contradictions, but to the neighbors who peered through their curtains at the rising walls of his new estate, he was something else entirely. He was Jewish. He was German. He was new money. And he was building something that would scream so loud the old money would have no choice but to listen. The approach to the castle today still retains that sense of calculated intimidation. The driveway winds through trees that seem to have witnessed too much history, twisting upward toward the summit of the hill. And it is crucial to remember that the hill itself is a lie. The elevation was not enough for Kahn's vision, so he ordered the earth to be moved. 2 years were spent just terraforming the landscape, forcing the ground to rise up to meet his ego. It creates a sense of dislocation, as if the castle exists in a separate layer of reality detached from the mundane world below. When the structure finally breaks the horizon, it hits you with the force of a physical blow. The slate roof, the sheer verticality of the walls, the rhythmic repetition of the windows, it is French chateau architecture weaponized for American dominance. It is beautiful, yes. But that is just the facade. Underneath the symmetry and the manicured gardens lies a foundation built on a profound existential anxiety. This was not a house built for comfort, it was a house built for protection. Protection from irrelevance. Protection from rejection. Protection from the gnawing fear that no matter how much gold you accumulate, you will always be a guest in someone else's country. The air here tastes of wood smoke and old money, but if you inhale deeply enough you can smell the desperation. It lingers in the courtyard where limousines once idled. It seeps from the mortar of the limestone blocks. This is the story of a man who tried to buy immortality and found that the price was higher than even he could afford. The context of the Gold Coast is essential because Oheka was not built in a vacuum, it was built as a reaction to a specific social climate that was as hostile as it was glittery. In the years following the First World War, America was drunk on its own rising power. The economy was revving its engine, preparing for the roar of the 20s, and Wall Street was the furnace feeding the fire. But socially, the lines were drawn with razor wire. The patrician families of New York, the Knickerbocker elite, viewed the influx of new wealth with a mixture of horror and disdain. They retreated to their country estates on Long Island, creating a pastoral fantasy where they could pretend the industrialization that funded their lives did not exist. They built houses that looked like English manors and Italian villas, wrapping themselves in the aesthetics of the past to legitimize their present power. Otto Kahn saw this performance and decided to outdo it. He did not want to blend in, he wanted to conquer. He had previously built a massive estate in Morristown, New Jersey, a place of rolling hills and quiet dignity, but the anti-Semitism of the local country clubs had been a subtle, constant, stinging reminder of his place in the pecking order. When he was denied membership or treated with that peculiar polite coldness that the upper class has perfected, he didn't just get angry, he got ambitious. He looked east to Long Island, where the competition was fiercer and the stakes were higher. He bought 443 acres of land, a tract so large it encompassed farms and forests, and he decided to build something that could not be ignored. The psychology of this decision is fascinating and tragic. It is the psychology of the eternal outsider. Khan believed that if he built a structure of sufficient grandeur, a place of such undeniable taste and artistic merit, the barriers of prejudice would simply dissolve. He believed in the alchemy of architecture, that stone could transmute blood. So he hired the architects Delano and Aldrich, the darlings of the establishment, men who understood the language of power, and instructed them to speak it louder than anyone else. The design they settled on was not the restrained Georgian brick of his neighbors. It was a sprawling French chateau, a style that evoked the absolute monarchy of the Sun King. It was a choice that said, "I am not just rich, I am sovereign." The neighbors watched with a mix of awe and resentment as the plans were unveiled. They whispered about the audacity of it. They whispered about the cost. But mostly they whispered about the man who thought he could buy his way into their history. The Gold Coast was a place of illusions where stockbrokers played at being landed gentry, but Oheka was the greatest illusion of them all. It was a castle without a king, a palace without a lineage. It was a stage waiting for a play that would never quite have a happy ending. The very land it sat on seemed to resist the intrusion, requiring massive engineering feats to stabilize the dream. This was the era of the Great Gatsby, and while Fitzgerald's novel is fiction, the emotional landscape it describes is the reality of Oheka. The longing, the green light at the end of the dock, the belief that you can rewrite your past if you just build a big enough house. Oheka was Otto Kahn's green light solidified into masonry. It was a beacon that shone brightly across the Sound, signaling to the world that he had arrived, even if he never truly felt at home when he walked through the front door. Otto Hermann Kahn was a man composed of distinct and often warring fragments. To the public, he was the financier, the partner at Kuhn Loeb and Company, the man who reorganized the railroads and helped finance the Allied war effort. He was a titan of industry, a figure of immense gravity who moved markets with a whisper. He was known as the King of New York, creating a persona of infallibility that was necessary for survival in the cutthroat world of banking. But inside the banker lived an artist who had been suffocated by duty. Born in Germany to a banking family, Kahn had dreamed of being a musician, a poet, a creator of beauty. Instead, he was steered into the family business, his artistic soul shoved into a three-piece suit. This internal conflict defined his entire life, and it defined Oheka. The castle was his canvas. Since he could not be the artist, he would be the patron, the Maecenas of the 20th century. He poured his frustrated creativity into the curation of his life. He was a man of impeccable dress, often seen with a white mustache perfectly waxed and eyes that held a deep well of melancholy. People described him as charming and cosmopolitan, but there was always a distance, a pane of glass between him and the rest of the world. He was the most American of Europeans and the most European of Americans, belonging fully to neither continent. This sense of displacement fueled his need for Oheka. He wanted a sanctuary where the rules of the outside world did not apply, where he could construct a reality that aligned with his idealized self. He was a Jew who attended St. Thomas Episcopal Church, not out of religious conversion but out of social assimilation, yet he never hid his heritage, remaining a proud board member of Jewish federations. He walked a tightrope over a canyon of prejudice, balancing perfectly while carrying the weight of his empire. The insecurity was the engine. Why else build a dining room that seats 50 unless you are terrified of eating alone? Why build a ballroom with ceilings so high they vanish into shadow unless you are trying to minimize your own mortality? Kahn was driven by a hunger that food could not satiate. He wanted to be remembered not for his money but for his taste. He wanted to be seen as a modern Medici. He surrounded himself with artists, musicians, and thinkers, using Oheka as a bait to lure the creative genius he so admired. He was generous to a fault, supporting the Metropolitan Opera, constantly bailing out struggling theaters, and funding the careers of countless performers. But there is a tragedy in patronage. The artist loves the patron's checkbook, but they rarely love the patron. Kahn was always the man paying the bill, the man standing just outside the spotlight, applauding the loudest, hoping that some of the glory would reflect back onto him. Oheka was the physical manifestation of this dynamic. It was grand, it was imposing, but it was also incredibly lonely. It was a house built for an audience of thousands, but designed by a man who felt singular. As we peel back the layers of this story, we must keep Otto Kahn the man in focus, not the caricature of the monopoly man, but the sensitive, insecure soul who built a fortress to keep out the cold winds of rejection, only to find that the chill was coming from inside the walls. The conception of Oheka began with a demand for the impossible. When Khan sat down with William Adams Delano and Chester Holmes Aldrich in 1915, he did not ask for a house, he asked for a statement. He told them he wanted a fireproof house. This was his primary obsession. He had seen other great estates burned to the ground, consumed by the very timber that framed them. He was terrified of fire, terrified of erasure. He wanted something that would last forever, something that could not be turned to ash. This requirement dictated everything that followed. Oheka would be the first private residence in America built entirely of steel and concrete. It would be a skyscraper disguised as a chateau. The architects were faced with a paradox: how to build a structure that felt warm and domestic while using materials that were cold and industrial. They looked to the chateaus of the Loire Valley for inspiration, specifically the Château de Fontainebleau. They designed a structure that was U-shaped, centering around a massive crushed stone courtyard. The scale was non-negotiable. Khan wanted it to be the highest point on the Gold Coast, but the geography of Cold Spring Harbor was not cooperative. The natural hill was not high enough to offer the commanding views of the Sound that Khan required. So the order was given to build a mountain. It is hard to comprehend the hubris of this in an era before modern earth-moving equipment. It was a biblical undertaking. The vision was total. It wasn't just the house, it was the integration of the house into the landscape. Khan wanted the gardens to be an extension of the architecture, living rooms with walls of hedging and ceilings of sky. He hired the Olmsted brothers, the sons of the man who designed Central Park, to handle the landscape architecture. They designed a French formal garden that stretched out from the rear terrace, a geometric masterpiece of reflecting pools, fountains, and statuary that led the eye toward the horizon. The design was all about perspective, about controlling the view. From the library window, Khan wanted to look out and see a world that was entirely ordered, entirely under his control. The chaos of the stock market, the chaos of the war, the chaos of social climbing, all of it was banished by the rigid symmetry of the design. The house was designed to be a machine for living, but a machine that operated on a scale that dwarfed its inhabitants. The hallways were wide enough to drive a car through. The staircases were designed for grand entrances, not for tired people climbing to bed. Every doorway was an arch, every window a frame. It was architecture as theater. But even in the blueprint phase, there were cracks in the vision. The sheer size of the servant quarters needed to run this behemoth was a red flag. It required a regiment to operate. It was a design that assumed the world of 1919 would last forever, that there would always be an endless supply of cheap labor and an endless stream of income. It was a design that lacked foresight even as it strove for immortality. It was a dinosaur built at the very moment the meteor was entering the atmosphere. The construction of Oheka was a brutal ballet of labor and logistics that lasted for 2 agonizing years just for the foundation. Before a single stone could be laid, the hill had to be built. It was a scene reminiscent of the building of the pyramids. Hundreds of laborers, many of them immigrants recently arrived at Ellis Island, were transported to the site. They wielded shovels and pickaxes, operating steam shovels that belched black smoke into the pristine Long Island air. They moved millions of tons of earth, reshaping the topography of the coastline. It was a violent act against nature. The hill was built up layer by layer, compacted and graded until it reached the elevation Khan demanded. Then came the materials. Because the house was to be fireproof, traditional wood framing was banned. Instead, train car after train car arrived laden with steel beams, reinforced concrete, and brick. The logistics of getting these materials from the railhead to the site were a nightmare. New roads had to be built just to handle the weight of the trucks. The local townspeople watched in stunned silence as the skeleton of the beast began to rise. It looked less like a home and more like a factory or a terminal. The steel grid rose into the sky, cold and gray, before being clad in limestone. The limestone itself was a story. It was sourced from the finest quarries, chosen for its color and durability, but even the stone was a facade. In many places, the walls were brick covered in stucco, scored to look like stone, a theatrical trick to save weight and cost, though cost seemed to be of no object. The price tag began to spiral out of control. Estimates vary, but it is believed Khan spent $11 million on the construction in 1919 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that figure is staggering, nearly $150 million today. But the money was just paper to Khan. The real cost was in the human effort. Accidents were common. The pace was relentless. Khan was an exacting client, visiting the site, frequently pointing his cane at details. He didn't like demanding walls be torn down and rebuilt if they were an inch out of alignment. He was building a monument, and monuments do not tolerate imperfection. The construction site was a city unto itself, with mess halls, bunkhouses, and workshops. Artisans were brought in from Europe, plasterers from Italy, woodcarvers from Germany, ironworkers from France. It was a melting pot of craftsmanship, all directed toward the glorification of one man's ego. As the roof finally went on slate tile by slate tile, the neighbors realized that Khan had won. He had built the biggest thing in the sky. He had dominated the landscape. But in doing so, he had also isolated himself. The sheer scale of the construction set him apart. It was too big to be neighborly. It was a fortress, and fortresses are designed to keep people out as much as they are designed to keep people in. The silence of the finished house was bought with the noise of 1,000 hammers and the sweat of 1,000 men, a debt of labor that the stone would hold forever. The architecture of Oheka is a study in intimidation. It is not designed to welcome, it is designed to awe. As you step through the massive wrought iron gates, the influence of the French formal style is immediate and overwhelming. The facade is a rhythmic procession of pilasters and arched windows, a wall of pale stone that seems to glow in the moonlight. But it is the details that reveal the darkness. The entrance is not a simple door, it is a portal. You pass into a vestibule that feels like the antechamber of a cathedral. The air changes. It becomes cooler, stiller. The grand staircase is the centerpiece, a sweeping curve of marble and wrought iron that mimics the famous stairs at Fontainebleau. It was designed for the entrance of a queen or a debutante descending to meet her suitors. But the railing is cold to the touch. The banisters are wrought into intricate shapes that resemble vines or perhaps chains, depending on your mood. The ceilings in the main rooms are soaring coffered masterpieces, painted and gilded with a precision that borders on the obsessive. In the library, the walls were lined with walnut paneling, dark and rich, intended to absorb the sound of the outside world. Khan filled these shelves with thousands of books, many of them rare first editions bound in leather. But one wonders how many he actually read. The room feels less like a place for reading and more like a shrine to knowledge, a place where one could pose with a book rather than read it. The dining room is perhaps the most telling space. It is vast, capable of seating dozens at a single table. The windows look out over the formal gardens, creating a backdrop of rigid nature. But the acoustics of the room are such that a whisper at one end can be heard at the other. There are no secrets in Oheka. The architecture amplifies everything. The ballroom, heavily influenced by the Hall of Mirrors, is a cavern of light. Chandeliers dripping with crystal hang like frozen tears from the ceiling. The floor is sprung, meant to cushion the feet of dancers, but when empty it creaks with a mournful sound. The bedrooms, specifically Khan's suite, are strangely modest compared to the public spaces. Creates a jarring contrast. The public man lived in a palace, the private man slept in a box. The hidden architecture is just as fascinating. Hidden doors, secret passageways built into the bookcases, allowing servants to slip in and out unseen. The house was designed to make the labor invisible. The architecture conspired to maintain the illusion that the house ran itself, that the fires lit themselves and the beds made themselves. It was a deception built into the floor plan, a structural enforcement of the class divide. The walls were thick enough to hide the plumbing, the wiring, and the humanity of the people who kept the beast alive. The obsession with fire defined the bones of Oheka. Otto Khan's fear was not irrational, it was a response to the trauma of his era. He had seen the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. He had seen the destruction of European cities during the Great War. He equated fire with chaos, with the uncontrollable force that could wipe away a legacy in an hour. So he built a house that could not burn. There is no wooden framework in Oheka. The floors are concrete slabs reinforced with steel mesh. The roof is slate on steel trusses. Even the decorative elements were chosen for their resistance to flame. This decision gave the house a peculiar acoustic quality. It does not creak and settle like a wooden house. It echoes. It has the sonic footprint of a bunker. If you stomp your foot in the hallway, the sound is hard and flat. This use of industrial materials in a luxury setting was revolutionary, but it also made the house cold. Literally cold. The stone and concrete acted as a heat sink, sucking the warmth out of the air. To combat this, Khan had to install a heating system of monstrous proportions. Giant boilers in the subbasement consumed tons of coal a day just to keep the chill at bay. The house was a thermal battleground. The fireproofing also meant that renovations were nearly impossible. You could not just knock down a wall to open up a room. The walls were load-bearing concrete immovable objects. This rigidity reflected Khan's desire for permanence. He wanted to fix his world in place to create a static point in a turning universe. But in doing so, he created a tomb. A fireproof house is also a house that does not breathe. The air inside Oheka can feel stagnant, trapped. It is a sealed system. During the construction, they say Khan tested the fireproofing by having a fire built in one of the rooms while he stood in the next room, overconfident in his engineering. The story may be apocryphal, but it fits the man. He needed to trust the barrier. He needed to know that he was safe. But the irony is that while the house could not burn, it could rot. Concrete can crack, steel can rust. Water, the element he didn't fear as much, proved to be the more insidious enemy. But in 1919, the house stood as a triumph of engineering over nature, a fireproof box for a man who was burning up on the inside. The machine that ran Oheka was a human one. To maintain the illusion of effortless luxury, Khan employed a staff of 126 servants. 126 people whose entire existence was dedicated to the comfort of one family. This was a village within a house. The hierarchy was rigid, military in its precision. At the top was the estate superintendent, the general of the army. Below him were the butlers, the housekeepers, the valets, the chefs, the sous-chefs, the gardeners, the chauffeurs, the groomsmen, and the chambermaids. They lived in a separate wing, a warren of smaller rooms that were starkly different from the opulence of the main house. Yet even these quarters were better than what most Americans had. Khan paid well. He had to. The isolation of the estate meant that the staff had to live on site. They were prisoners of the castle just as much as Khan was. The sheer logistics of feeding and clothing the staff was an industry in itself. The kitchens were industrial spaces tiled in white, buzzing with activity from 4 in the morning until midnight. The laundry room was a steam-filled purgatory where linens were boiled, pressed, and folded with geometric exactitude. There was a constant flow of activity in the service corridors, the downstairs of the house that the guests never saw. These invisible corridors were the arteries of the beast. Through them traveled the food, the coal, the clean sheets, and the gossip. The staff knew everything. They knew when Khan was happy, they knew when he was brooding, they knew the secrets of the guests who stayed in the guest suites. They were the silent witnesses to history, but they were also a collective machine. Their individuality was suppressed in favor of their function. A maid was not a person, she was a pair of hands to turn down a bed. A gardener was not a man, he was a force to keep the hedges trimmed. This dehumanization was standard for the era, but at Oheka the scale made it grotesque. The ratio of servants to family members was absurd. At times it was 20 to 1. 20 people to serve one person. It created a strange atmosphere of surveillance. You were never truly alone at Oheka. There was always someone polishing a handle in the distance, someone trimming a rose bush. The privacy Khan sought was an illusion. He had surrounded himself with a crowd in order to be alone. And the cost of this army was astronomical. The payroll alone was a fortune. The uniforms, the food, the housing, it was a constant drain on the Khan fortune. Oheka was a hungry mouth that never stopped eating money. And the staff, they were the ones who truly knew the house. They knew which steps creaked, they knew which rooms were coldest. They were the ghosts in the machine, essential but ignored, powering a fantasy that they were not allowed to share. The parties at Oheka are the stuff of legend, the gold dust memories that people still cling to when they talk about the Roaring Twenties. This is where the Great Gatsby connection becomes tangible. Whether or not Fitzgerald stood on this specific terrace is irrelevant, the spirit of Gatsby was enshrined here. Khan threw parties that were designed to stun. He didn't just invite the neighbors, he imported the culture of the world. Opera singers like Enrico Caruso would sing from the balcony, their voices carrying over the sunken garden. Charlie Chaplin would perform impromptu skits in the ballroom. The Ziegfeld Follies girls would dance on the lawn. It was a carnival of the elite. The driveway would be choked with Rolls Royces and Packards, the headlights cutting through the night like searchlights. The champagne flowed not in bottles but in cases. It was the height of prohibition, but the laws of the United States stopped at the gates of Oheka. Inside it was a wet world, a sanctuary of indulgence. Khan moved through these parties with a quiet grace, a small smile on his face, observing the spectacle he had created. He was the ringmaster. He loved to mix the groups. He would invite the stiff bankers from Wall Street and mix them with the bohemian artists from Greenwich Village. He enjoyed the friction, the clash of cultures. He wanted to force the old money to acknowledge the vitality of the new. But there was a hollowness to the revelry. The guests drank his wine, ate his food, and danced on his floors, but many of them still sneered at him behind his back. They called him the Fly King, a derogatory reference to his swift rise. They whispered about his Jewishness even as they accepted his hospitality. The parties were a transaction. Khan bought their presence with luxury, and they paid him with a temporary suspension of their prejudice. And when the music stopped, when the last car drove away down the long dark driveway, the silence would return with a vengeance. The confetti on the floor looked like trash in the morning light. The empty bottles looked like accusations. The party was a drug, a temporary high to mask the underlying loneliness of the estate. Khan would retreat to his library, the sounds of the jazz age fading, leaving him alone with his first editions and his thoughts. The parties were beautiful, yes, but they were also a scream into the void, a desperate attempt to fill the empty rooms with life, to prove that Oheka was not a tomb but a palace of joy. But joy is hard to manufacture and even harder to sustain. The family dynamic within Oheka was complex and often strained. Otto's wife, Addie Wolf, was a woman of high society, but she was more reserved than her husband. She came from a wealthy German Jewish family, and while she was accustomed to luxury, the scale of Oheka was something else. It was overwhelming. Raising children in a museum is not easy. The Khan children, Maud, Margaret, Gilbert, and Roger, grew up in a world of surreal privilege but also of isolation. Imagine playing hide and seek in a house where you could get lost for hours. Imagine having a playroom that was larger than most people's homes but having no one to play with but your siblings and the servants. The children were raised by nannies and governesses, their contact with their parents formalized by the architecture and the lifestyle. They were displayed like dolls at the parties, dressed in the finest clothes, presented to the guests, and then whisked away. There was a coldness to their upbringing, a distance enforced by the square footage. Otto loved his children dearly, his letters prove that, but he was a man consumed by his work and his obsessions. He was often absent, either physically in the city or mentally in his plans. Addie tried to make the castle a home. She filled the rooms with flowers, she organized intimate family dinners, but the house fought her. It was too big to be intimate. It was designed for a crowd, not a family. The children grew up with a warped sense of reality. They knew they were different, they knew they were royalty in a republic. This privilege was a burden. It set them apart from their peers. How do you relate to normal people when you live in a castle? How do you understand the value of $1 when your father owns the bank? The psychological toll on the family was subtle but real. They were actors in Otto's play, living out a script they hadn't written. The pressure to be perfect, to be worthy of the setting, was constant. And beneath it all was the shadow of their heritage. They were the richest Jewish family in America, living in the most anti-Semitic era of American history. They were safe behind the gates, but they knew that outside the world was hostile. Oheka was a gilded cage, beautiful, comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. The children eventually grew up and moved away, eager to escape the weight of the stone. They sought smaller lives that were their own. The house was left to the parents, a nest that was far too large for 2 birds. The empty bedrooms became monuments to the children who had fled, echoing with the silence of a family that had dispersed. The financial reality of Oheka was a horror story disguised as a ledger. We talk about the construction cost, but the operating costs were the true killer. In the 1920s, it cost roughly $500,000 a year just to keep the doors open. That is over $7 million a year in today's money. Just to exist. The coal bill alone was a fortune. The staff payroll, the taxes, the maintenance of the grounds, the repairs, it was a hemorrhage of cash. Otto Khan was one of the wealthiest men in the world, but even his pockets had bottoms. He was funding this personal kingdom with the profits from investment banking, a volatile and stressful profession. Every time the market dipped, the pressure to maintain Oheka increased. He was running on a treadmill that was speeding up. There is a dark side to this wealth. Where did it come from? It came from the consolidation of railroads, the firing of workers, the ruthless efficiency of capitalism. The beauty of the formal gardens was fertilized with the sweat of the working class. Khan was a benevolent capitalist by the standards of his time, but he was still a part of the machine that ground people down. The disparity between the luxury of Oheka and the poverty of the tenements in New York City was grotesque. Khan knew this. He was a man of conscience. He gave away millions to charity trying to balance the scales. But he could not stop spending on the house. It was an addiction. He was constantly adding, improving, changing. New statues for the garden. New tapestries for the hall. It was a compulsion. He was trying to fill a hole that could not be filled with things. The financial strain was a constant low-level hum in the background of his life. He had to keep making deals, he had to keep winning in order to feed the beast on the hill. The house became a master and he became the servant. He worked himself to exhaustion to pay for a place where he was supposed to relax. The irony is palpable. The ultimate symbol of freedom, immense wealth, became a trap. He could not sell it, who could afford to buy it? He could not close it, that would be an admission of defeat. He was stuck. He had built a white elephant out of limestone and now he had to ride it until he died. The bills kept coming. The coal kept burning. The machine kept eating. And Otto Khan kept writing the checks hoping that the money would never run out. Otto Khan lived a double life, not in a criminal sense but in a spiritual one. By day he was the wolf of Wall Street, the man in the boardroom making cold calculated decisions. He dealt in mergers, acquisitions, and the brutal realities of finance. But by night and on weekends at Oheka, he tried to be something else entirely. He tried to be a Renaissance man. He surrounded himself with the soft power of art to counterbalance the hard power of money. He was the chairman of the Metropolitan Opera and Oheka was his private opera house. He would sit in the listening room, eyes closed, losing himself in the music, trying to wash away the grime of the marketplace. This duality was the core of his tragedy. He was a man who successfully conquered the material world but felt like an imposter in the spiritual one. He wanted to be accepted by the artists as an equal, not just a wallet. He wrote essays on art and culture, trying to prove his intellectual worth. He gave speeches. He was desperate to be seen as a thinker, a philosopher. But the world only saw the banker. They saw the checkbook. At Oheka, he would host weekends where the strict social rules were relaxed. He would walk the gardens with poets and playwrights, engaging in deep conversations about the soul, about the future, about beauty. In those moments, he was happy. In those moments, he felt he was living the life he was meant to live. But then Monday morning would come. The limousine would wait in the courtyard. The driver would open the door. And the artist would have to die so the banker could live. The drive back to the city was a transition back to the armor. He would watch the castle fade in the rearview mirror, a dream shrinking in the distance. This split personality took a toll on his health. The stress of maintaining two personas, the exertion of being the perfect host and the perfect shark, wore him down. He was burning the candle at both ends and in the middle. Oheka was the physical manifestation of this split. The harsh steel structure, hidden by the beautiful stone facade, was a perfect metaphor for Khan himself. A man of steel wrapped in art, trying to hold it all together as the world began to change around him. The turning point came not with a bang but with a slow creeping darkness. As the 1920s drew to a close, the atmosphere at Oheka began to shift. The parties became more frantic, as if everyone knew the music was about to stop. The excesses of the jazz age were reaching a fever pitch. There was a sense of doom in the air, a feeling that this level of consumption could not be sustained. The stock market was overheating. Khan saw the signs. He was a brilliant financier, he knew the numbers didn't add up. He warned people. He tried to caution his friends. But no one wanted to listen. They were too busy dancing in his ballroom. The crash of 1929 did not destroy Khan personally, he was too diversified, too smart to be wiped out completely. But it destroyed the world that Oheka was built for. The era of the Gold Coast was over. The mood of the country turned from admiration of the wealthy to anger. The rich were no longer idols, they were villains. Oheka suddenly looked different. It didn't look like a palace anymore, it looked like a crime scene. It looked like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The neighbors stopped throwing parties. The lights went out in the mansions along the shore. Servants were let go. Gardens were left to grow wild. Khan kept Oheka running, but it was a struggle. The joy was gone. The house felt heavier. The silence in the hallways grew deeper. The guests were fewer. The laughter was forced. Khan continued his routine, but his steps were slower. The weight of the world was pressing down on him. He had built a monument to an era that had just committed suicide. He was living in a mausoleum of the Gilded Age while the Great Depression raged outside his gates. The contrast was unbearable. People were starving in the streets of New York, and he was heating a 127-room castle. The guilt must have been crushing. The psychological fortress he had built was no longer effective. The reality of the suffering world breached the walls. Oheka became a burden, a reminder of a vanity that now seemed obscene. The golden hour was over. The blue hour of decline had begun. The end of the dream came on March 29, 1934. Otto Kahn sat down for lunch at his private dining room in the Kuhn Loeb building in New York City. He was 67 years old. He had just finished a meeting. He slumped forward and died of a massive heart attack. Just like that, the engine stopped. The visionary was gone. And without the visionary, the vision collapsed instantly. Kahn's death was the death knell for Oheka. He had left a substantial estate, but the taxes were ruinous. The Great Depression had eroded much of the asset value. His family, devastated by the loss, looked at the castle not as a home but as a white elephant. Addie could not live there alone. The children did not want it. It was too big, too expensive, too full of ghosts. They closed it up. The shutters were drawn. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The servants were dismissed. The army that kept the house alive was disbanded. For the first time since 1919, the house was truly silent. No coal in the boilers. No music in the ballroom. No water in the fountains. It sat on the hill like a great stone corpse. The family tried to sell it, but who buys a 127-room castle in the middle of the Great Depression? The market for such properties was non-existent. It sat on the market for years. The price dropped and dropped. Finally, in 1939, 5 years after Otto's death, the family did the unthinkable. They sold it. And they didn't sell it to a prince or a tycoon. They sold it to the welfare fund of the sanitation workers of New York City. The retreat of the ultimate capitalist became a retreat for the working man. There is a profound irony in this. The house built to exclude became a house for the people who cleaned the streets. The name was changed. The furnishings were sold off or moved. The art was dispersed. The soul of the house was stripped away, leaving only the shell. The sanitation workers used it as a retirement retreat, a place for sweepers and garbage men to rest their weary backs. Otto Kahn might have appreciated the irony, or he might have been horrified. But the house had begun its descent. It was no longer a private kingdom. It was an institution. The walls remained, but the spirit had fled. The sanitation workers didn't stay long. In 1942, with the world at war again, the government seized the property. It became a training center for the merchant marine radio operators. Then, in 1948, it was sold to the Eastern Military Academy. This was the beginning of the long gray period of Oheka's history. For 30 years, it was a boarding school. The cadets marched in the formal gardens where Ziegfeld girls once danced. They slept in bunk beds in the grand bedrooms. The ballroom became a gymnasium. The library became a classroom. The military academy did not treat the building with reverence. They treated it as a facility. They painted over the frescoes. They partitioned the great rooms. They drilled holes in the marble. The abuse was systematic. The house was tough. It was built of steel and concrete, so it survived the structural abuse, but the aesthetic abuse was severe. The delicate beauty of the interiors was erased layer by layer. The gardens were paved over or neglected. The reflecting pools filled with algae. The statues were broken. It was a slow humiliation. The house was being punished for its grandeur. It was being forced to be utilitarian. The cadets who lived there tell stories of the cold, of the strange noises, of the feeling of being watched. The ghost of Otto Kahn was surely pacing the halls, horrified by the regimentation of his artistic sanctuary. The academy closed in 1979 bankrupt. The building was abandoned again. And this time there was no one to look after it. No guards. No caretakers. Just the empty shell on the hill waiting for the end. The era of total ruin began in 1979. For 5 years Oheka stood empty and unguarded. It became a playground for vandals, a target for arsonists. This is the darkest chapter. The locals knew it was empty. Kids would break in to party. They smashed the windows. They spray-painted the walls. They set fires. Over 100 documented arson attempts occurred during this period. But the house refused to die. Khan's obsession with fireproofing saved it. The fires would burn the trash and the graffiti, but they couldn't consume the structure. The concrete held. The steel held. But the damage was catastrophic. The slate roof began to fail. Water poured in. The plaster ceilings collapsed. The wood paneling was ripped out for firewood. The gardens were a jungle of weeds and vines. It looked like a post-apocalyptic ruin. It was known as the ghost of the Gold Coast. It was a symbol of total decay. If you walked through it in 1982, you would have seen the skeleton of the dream. Debris everywhere. The smell of urine and wet ash. The wind whistling through the broken windows. It was terrifying and tragic. It was the ultimate proof of the futility of material wealth. All that money, all that effort, all that ambition reduced to a pile of rubble and graffiti. It seemed destined for the wrecking ball. Developers were circling, eyeing the land, wanting to tear down the castle and build a subdivision of condos. It was worth more dead than alive. The local government didn't care. It was an eyesore, a dangerous nuisance. Otto Khan's legacy was days away from being erased completely. The silence of the hill was now the silence of the grave. Then came the second visionary. In 1984, a Long Island developer named Gary Milius bought Oheka and the remaining 23 acres for $1.5 million. It was a steal, but it was also a suicide mission. Everyone told him he was crazy. The building was a wreck. It had no windows, no electricity, no plumbing, no roof in many places. It was a shell. But Milius saw something. He saw the bones. He saw the potential. He was a man not unlike Khan. Ambitious, determined, and willing to take a massive risk. He didn't buy it to tear it down. He bought it to bring it back to life. The restoration of Oheka is the largest private residential renovation project in American history. It was an archaeological dig as much as a construction project. They had to hunt down the original blueprints. They had to find the quarries where the stone came from. They had to learn how to make the plaster moldings by hand. It was a labor of love and madness. Milius poured millions into the project. He faced bankruptcy multiple times. He fought with the town, he fought with the banks. It was a mirror of Khan's struggle. The house demanded everything from its owner. Milius lived in the ruin while he fixed it. He slept with a shotgun to chase away the vandals. He became the guardian of the stone. The restoration was not just about fixing the walls, it was about restoring the dignity of the structure. It took decades. It is still ongoing. The roof was replaced slate by slate. The windows were custom-made to match the originals. The gardens were dug out from under feet of overgrowth. Slowly, painfully, the castle began to re-emerge from the coma. The color returned to the cheeks of the building. The lights came back on. The restoration process was a war against entropy. The cost was astronomical, estimated at over $40 million. Milius had to be creative to fund it. He turned the castle into a business. Couldn't be a private home anymore, the economics didn't work. So it became a wedding venue, a hotel, a movie set. The commercialization of Oheka was the price of its survival. Khan might have scoffed at the idea of strangers paying to sleep in his bedrooms or pop stars filming music videos in his library. Taylor Swift shot Blank Space. They're a song about madness and luxury, fittingly enough. But this commercial use is what saved it. The building had to earn its keep. The restoration team worked with a level of craftsmanship that honored the original builders. They brought in artisans to recreate the Faubourg painting. They restored the wrought iron railing of the grand staircase. They found the original furniture or bought period-correct pieces to fill the empty rooms. It was a resurrection. But it is a zombie resurrection. The house looks like it did in 1920, but it doesn't feel the same. Feels like a hotel. The personal touches of the Khan family are gone, replaced by the generic luxury of the hospitality industry. It is beautiful, stunning even, but it is a business. The soul of the house, the anxious striving spirit of Otto Khan, is gone, replaced by the calm efficiency of event planners. Yet the physical feat is undeniable. To bring a building back from the brink of total destruction is a miracle. It stands today as a testament to stubbornness. Both Khan's stubbornness in building it and Milius's stubbornness in saving it. Today Oheka Castle sits on its hill, restored and gleaming. It is a popular destination for the wealthy to get married, to play out their own fantasies of aristocracy for a night. The grass is green, the fountains are flowing. But if you look closely, you can still see the scars. You can see where the new stone meets the old. You can feel the disconnect between the building and the modern world. It is an anachronism, a dinosaur in the age of the internet. It serves as a backdrop for the new Gilded Age. The hedge fund managers and tech billionaires who get married there are the spiritual successors to Khan, but they lack his tragic depth. They are renting the costume. Khan owned the factory. The castle has become a simulacrum of itself. It is an image of an image. The dark history, the labor, the fire, the ruin is all whitewashed by the restoration. The guests drinking champagne in the courtyard don't know about the sanitation workers. They don't know about the arsonists. They don't know about the cold nights Otto spent worrying about acceptance. They just see the pretty facade. And perhaps that is the ultimate tragedy. The history is erased by the beauty. The struggle is hidden by the luxury. Oheka has succeeded in its original mission to intimidate and impress, but it has failed in its mission to grant immortality. Otto Khan is largely a footnote, a name on a plaque. The house is the celebrity. The stone outlived the man, but the stone doesn't care. So what does Oheka Castle teach us? It is a philosophical problem wrapped in limestone. It teaches us about the hubris of building. We build to say, I was here. But the building eventually says, you are gone. It teaches us about the cycle of money. Wealth creates beauty, beauty decays into ruin, and new wealth resurrects it as a commodity. It teaches us that a house is not a home if it is built as a fortress. Khan died searching for peace that his castle could not provide. The walls kept the fire out, but they couldn't keep the sadness out. Standing on the terrace today, looking out over the formal gardens toward the cold spring harbor, you feel a profound sense of impermanence. The wind is the same wind that blew in 1919. The sky is the same, but everything else has changed. The Gold Coast is gone, replaced by suburbia. The servants are gone. The grandeur is now a rental. Oheka stands as a beautiful hollow monument to social insecurity. It is a cautionary tale written in the grandest handwriting imaginable. It whispers that you cannot buy your way into history without paying a terrible price. And as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen across the great lawn, the castle seems to retreat into itself, pulling its secrets back behind the stone. It is a dark story dressed in light, a tragedy disguised as a fairy tale, and it remains alone on the hill, waiting for the next turning of the wheel.